We're going to start part two of our conversation, and we're going to bring up our honorees Shirley Franklin, Beverly Tatum, and Mary Byron. And we're going to start with Mary Byron. Mary Byron recently retired from her role as partner in the technology division at Goldman Sachs. During her 25-year career, Mary has been an active advocate for diversity and inclusion with a strong focus on the advancement of women and cross-cultural engagement. And Mary has been a longtime friend of this organization. Please welcome Mary Byron. Now I'd like to introduce the Honorable Shirley Franklin. Former mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, Shirley Franklin is well known for being the first African-American woman mayor of a major southern city, where she served 2 terms. The mayor's term there is limited, so she served the 2 that she could. Shirley is currently a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and aside from her role as a public official, her community service spans nearly 40 years in Atlanta and includes her active participation in the arts, homelessness, and higher education, and she is currently board chair for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Please welcome the Honorable Shirley Franklin. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Beverly Tatum, president of Spelman College. Beverly Daniel Tatum's tenure has been marked by a period of great innovation and growth. An accomplished administrator, Beverly is widely recognized as a race relations expert and a leader in higher education. Her areas of research include racial identity development and the role of race in the classroom. She is the author of Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, and my personal favorite, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. In 2005, Beverly was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for her innovative leadership in the field. Please welcome Beverly Tatum. We had a little powwow, and we decided that we were going to start on an optimistic note on this panel. And so I'd like to hear, because we have such a broad perspective, right? We have corporate politics and education. And what I would like to start with is, what are the trends that each of you are seeing from your perch of optimism when it comes to gender equality issues? Why don't I start with you?
Sure. Well, from my perspective, one of the most optimistic things is that more and more young women are going to college, in particular, young women of color. So, for example, young African-American women are among the fastest growing college-going population. So that's very optimistic.
Especially at a time when it's very expensive.
And that's what's not so optimistic.
All right.
In the sense that many young people want to go, are ready to go, and are motivated to be in school, and sometimes are in school, but aren't able to complete because they can't get access to the resources they need to be able to afford it.
Mrs. Mayor.
Well, again, I think that we're seeing more and more women, in politics, mayors love mayors, so I'm sorry about that. But we're seeing more women offer themselves for mayor. I served for 2 terms, and at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, there was a small group, maybe less than 20 women, who were actively engaged of a group of some 500 members. The last meeting in January, there were 65 women in the Women's Caucus. Now, that doesn't seem like a big jump, except that a few years ago, the Women's Caucus, when it was started by Senator Feinstein, she was mayor of San Francisco, it was never really listed on the program.
Which wasn't listed?
The Women's Caucus of the conference was never listed on the program. This time, the opening reception was honoring the women mayors. So we are seeing an acceptance of the organization that women are, first of all, here to stay. We're growing in number and growing in influence among women. And of course, we all know that there's a lot more talk about national politics with women, and that's exciting as well.
And Mary, what are you seeing from your corporate perch? Or former, should I say, now that you're retired?
That's right. It hasn't been so long that I've been retired that I don't still think that way a little bit. I would say two things really strike me. And one of those is more of the transparency now around what does unconscious bias mean and how does that operate in the workplace and what are the things that we need to do to combat that. And I think if you look at the messaging around young women in STEM and the work that's being done there to combat the stereotypes, the Barbie Who Codes controversy was one example of young women taking back that story and saying, no, it's not about girls need help to do these things. They're capable of doing them on their own, and let's change that narrative and change that story. And I see so much more of that now, both in workplaces and outside of the workplace, changing those stories and those narratives. And the second thing is, I think there's been we're at the tipping point of really engaging men in this and being inclusive in ways that we haven't always been. And I think that adding their voices and their talents to these conversations is going to enrich it for all of us.
Let's put those two observations together, which is, okay, now that there's awareness, how do you see it in application? In other words, you're saying that you're seeing more men also. I mean, in most corporate Americas,
Yes.
in our corporate America, you know, vast majority of senior leadership is men. So do you see is there some end result of this awareness, or is there some that you see coming shortly?
Yeah, I think one of the things we did when I was working in Asia is we had a sponsor program that was driven by the man who ran our region in Asia, who believed that you needed to create sponsorship for women, not just mentoring, and engaged all of the men and women leaders in creating that program. And I think that will become more the norm than it has been in the past.
So Shirley, you talk about 20 to 65. It doesn't sound like a lot, but I mean, getting elected is no small feat. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as the underpinnings that are or are not supporting women who either want to run or who are running?
Sure. I would say that when I ran for office in 2001, the hardest group for us to break through in my polls and in my election were African American women who were college graduates. They were the last to join into the campaign. Now there are some exceptions, and there are some of them in the room, so I want to thank the ones who were there early. But I do want to say that there was this hesitation that perhaps I wasn't the right woman, that maybe we needed a woman. And one of my favorite stories is a story of going door to door and speaking with a woman who seemed older then, but it was about my age now, who said that she thought that maybe I could do the job, but it was such a hard job, I really needed to let the guys do it, and then maybe I should wait my turn. College educated, 70 years old, really just not convinced that it was proper and appropriate that a woman would do such a tough job. So I asked her, well, do you think I'm not tough enough to do the job? She said, oh no, you're tough enough. I'm not sure that's the way women ought to be viewed. This is 2001, this is not a long time ago. So really kind of breaking through and demonstrating, I don't have it on today, but when I ran for office, and I was in office, I wore a flower. And people had this impression that I was this great gardener. When
I'm sensing maybe you weren't, but go ahead.
no, but the truth of the matter is I wore the flower because I knew there was this resistance to me, maybe having to be tough on certain issues, being aggressive, which was often called feisty, and being stubborn and determined, which the job required at various points. So I purposely tried to soften my physical image so that I would be acceptable in the public and not have to spend a whole lot of time on that.
In 14 years, has that
that's-
changed, though? Has that changed, do you
Well, I think it has. I was intentional about it. I think many of the young women who are running now, I mean, whether it's the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, or Stephanie Rawlings Blake in in Baltimore, they haven't had to do that. And that's just 10 years later. So they are, I mean, it seems like a really small thing. I certainly didn't change my position on anything. I really was trying to just get people calm down, that long enough to listen to the issue. Now, I don't think that's gone away, but it's every time a woman breaks through, we have the opportunity to lay a higher foundation for the next group to come along.
Beverly, you've been a president of a university where you've been educating young African American women and other women of color, actually, and some white women, actually, too. But what have you seen in terms of their confidence in leadership and what they develop being in that environment as opposed to what they come back and tell you when they leave that environment?
Yes.
In terms of what that dynamic that, like, say, the mayor has just mentioned.
It's interesting that you should ask me this question because I had a conversation with a young graduate today. And this was a young woman who graduated last year. She is now a graduate student. In this particular case, she's in a theater program, wants to be she's an aspiring actress. And she sent me an email saying, you know, Dr. Tatum, I really need some advice. Can you call me? And I said, send me your number, I'll call you. So I called her this afternoon, and the issue was young African-American woman concerned about the fact that in her drama program, the opportunities that are being presented to young women of color, young African-American women, are these very stereotypical roles. And so next year there's a plan for a play that has the opportunity, there are 3 black women in her program, and there's an opportunity for 2 of them to be in significant roles, and I don't know the name of the play, but the play, she was saying, is very stereotypical, and none of them are comfortable with this. So she was asking me my advice, what should we do? But what I was impressed by, she then, you know, told me why she thought the roles needed to be more nuanced, and, you know, she had a very clear and articulate explanation for what the problem was. And I said, you know, what you've just said to me is exactly what you should say, you know, to the head of your program. But as we were talking about it, it was very clear to me that she had a great deal of confidence, much more than I would have perhaps had at that age, to speak up for herself. And I hear this repeatedly from our graduates. And so one of the optimistic things is that the confidence that comes from being in an environment where your personhood is not questioned, but is affirmed and really lifted up in a way that allows you to really blossom and explore who you are, that gives you that confidence you need in environments that are perhaps not as affirming. The downside is, of course, there are still environments that are not as affirming. But the fact that she has this confidence to say, you know, we're not going to be. I mean, when we finished our conversation, she was ready to go to say, none of us is going to perform in this play. You need to come up with another one. And I think that's a very strong position to be in.
Would you attribute any of this, and Mary, I'm going to start with you. We talk about gender diversity, and there's a lot of, I'm not going to couch it how they told me to. Sorry, Anya. But this notion of this is, in order to be successful, to be a leader, these are the traits, they're very masculine, be tough negotiator, you know, just really stand up for yourself. I mean, would you attribute some of what Dr. Tatum just described about, you know, that confidence or that change in you see in women stepping up? I won't use the other words.
The L word.
The other word.
Right, we're not going to use the other word. Right.
I think there's a couple of things. I think one is there is just much more public dialogue about it. And so, you know, 25 years ago, when I was, you know, a young woman in the early days of my career, sexual harassment was pretty common. And if you spoke up, you were the one who lost your job. right? Not the perpetrators. And so that's changed, right? And the whole dialogue, both inside corporations and outside, is very different now. And so there's a place to have your voice that I think didn't exist for the women of our generation, or we didn't feel like that place existed in the same way. And I actually feel like it's getting us to be more vocal. So one of the things we used to train women when they heard things like, oh, that woman is very aggressive. We don't know if we should promote her. She's got sharp elbows. To say, well, to disrupt that thinking and to say, well, did you actually mean to say that she was appropriately assertive in achieving her goal? And just offer up a way that was comfortable for women to start to object to those things in that. And so I would train people to say, did you mean to say it like that? Because what I heard you say was this, that woman would get promoted, because of her gender, not because of her job performance, which is exemplary, and let me tell you why. And it's demeaning when you say it otherwise. So I think part of what these young women learn is that there is a public space, for that dialogue that wasn't there before, I think.
And Shirley, talk to us about some obstacles you see for women who want to run for office.
Well, one of the biggest obstacles is that women think it's a nasty, dirty business.
Isn't it?
And I mean, they,
I don't know, I've covered a few elections myself, and I don't know.
So I mean, one of the problems is that people think there's no way to hold on to your principles, that you're constantly compromising, and that you might have to compromise on your principles, and it's backroom dealing. I think there are examples. Hopefully, I helped with this in my terms in office, that's not the way it has to be when you talk about the role of.
But you see this more in women than men?
Oh, no, women.
Do you know what I mean? 'Cause it's just
women
hard. It's
really-
hard to run for office, regardless.
Well, I mean,
but for women,
first of
what
all,
are
it's
the particular?
expensive to run for office. Okay, so it's expensive to go to college. It's expensive to run for office, and so it's clearly an obstacle. Having the financial resources or having the know-how to do the kind of funding that we heard associated with the films. I mean, finding alternative ways to support your candidacy and recognizing you don't just win because you're a good candidate. You win because you have a good campaign, because you connect with voters, because you have a good message perhaps, because you have experience, because there's a need for diversity. There are a lot of reasons why you win. But it's not just because you are good.
Are funders opening up their wallets in a different way for women candidates than they were even, say, 10 or 15 years ago?
I hope so. Women are opening up their wallets. Early 20, 30 years ago, you usually did not get much of the country, certainly in the South. You did not get many contributions from women. That is no longer the case. Women are very active in political activities, advocacy, there are all kinds of initiatives now. But even with that, you have to have more than money. You have to build a network. And it has to be generally a network of people who don't always agree with you on everything. I mean, the key thing for being an elected official, I never wanted to be mayor. I ran reluctantly. I loved the job, but I did it for 8 years. I've worked for 35. So it's part of my life, not all consuming. The key is to recognize that when you are elected, you represent all of the people, not just those who supported you, not just those who contributed to you. Even though you need this support network desperately to win. But more and more women are contributing, and men are contributing as well.
Yeah, and that network, though, let's talk about funding. Do you see funding, higher education? I think we're all well aware there's some real challenges on many different levels. Are there some particular challenges that Spelman University faces as a university developing mostly young African American women?
Well, one of the challenges.
Just trying to get to that intersection, I think, that Hanya, that we've been talking about a little bit.
Well,
tonight.
part of the so that graph speaks to it in the sense that if you think of our natural constituents, our graduates, our alums, almost all are black women and are making less as a group than white men or white women. And so if you're relying on that population to support your institution, they have fewer resources to do so, particularly if you look at, historically. Now, certainly we are coming to a time when those who were graduating in the 80s and 90s are moving into significant corporate roles or other ways coming into their own wealth-making opportunities. And I'm very proud to say that we've just completed a $158 million campaign, and 71% of our graduates participated. Thank you. And so, it's a wonderful thing to be able to say, particularly we so often read, just today, I read the narrative about, graduates of HBCUs don't support their institutions, but 71% of Spelman alumni contributed to that campaign. So it's a tremendous level of support, but we also recognize the wealth disparity that is still in our communities, and we are serving a population. The median income for African American families is $40,000 a year. It is difficult to send a child to college if your income is $40,000 a year.
Before we close, Mary, obviously each one of these issues we could spend weeks on. Let's just, can you talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned this about the awareness and how, more men, sort of are engaging. What do you think, where does that take us? What's that next chapter in that book?
I think the next chapter in that book is recognizing that gender equality matters for all of us, and that the benefits for all of us, men and women, by taking men out of their gender norms and women out of theirs and the way in which they've traditionally been taught to us and socialized to us, is good for all of us. And that they... And I think it helps us broaden, because I think that the whole equality has to do with whether we can work our issues and drive equality across gender, across race, across sexual orientation and gender identity, and that we all have to be involved in that beyond just the perspective that we bring to it. And I think engaging men more in what we would traditionally have said are the women's issues is an important starting point for that.
I want to thank all of you very much. I'm telling you, they're doing this. Wrap it up.
Yes.
I just got to make a
Are we
closing.
getting shooed off the stage?
Yeah, we're
No,
getting
we
shooed.
need to be.
Gonged, all that.
But everyone here needs to think about running for office.
We'll
Those
end
are
on
the
that
people who make a
note. Right.
difference. At some point in your life.
Dr. Beverly Tatum, the Honorable Shirley Jackson, and Mary Byron, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.